Welcome to AI Founders Mindset. This podcast dives into the stories of visionary founders and the incredible people who power the startup ecosystem. Whether you are building your own venture or simply curious about the world of startups, you are in the right place. Today's episode, the conversation with Cameron. Counter-drone solution, protecting the future with Cameron Rowe. If you like our podcast, please subscribe it and give it a like. Let's get started. 行きましょう. Yes. Okay, Cameron, thank you so much for attending our podcast today. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you doing?
Great. We met the Defense Hackathon last weekend, right? How was the hackathon experience?
It was awesome. Shout out Andrew Cote. He did a really good job on the USS Hornet, which is just out in Alameda. It's an aircraft carrier that was used in World War II. Absolutely fantastic experience. I've been there twice now. This is the second time, and this time we were staying there very late. Some of the previous ones it shut down earlier, and so they had organized it so there were cots at a lower level, and it was essentially just a hackathon where people were taking on certain challenges that they were given. Many of them involved drones. We can talk about that a little bit, and it just was an awesome experience. The atmosphere was great. The people there were incredibly intelligent, and the things that everyone was working on, it was really exciting to see. Especially as a Canadian, we don't have many of those events of that size, specifically within the defense space. So it ended up being a lot of fun. I learned a lot as well. We were happy to sponsor it.
Okay, Cameron, tell us about yourself. What do you do in San Francisco?
So my name is Cameron Rowe. I'm the founder and CEO of Hober. We are a drone and counter-drone company. The way that we usually describe it is we help take out drones that can potentially harm people. And so it doesn't necessarily just have to be something on the front lines, like in Ukraine, like what we're seeing with FPV drones. We want to have solutions that have broad applications from commercial to military, and we just think if it's a great product, people are going to want to use it. A lot of the current counter-drone solutions are really, really expensive, and even if they are effective, they require lots of infrastructure, and typically they're mainly for military use, but there are many other applications outside of that, sort of the mid-market that we want to tackle.
Interesting. So I come from Japan. There are many drone companies because Japan, we are good to make hardware, right? So, and then your product, Hober's main product is encounter of drone. So why did you come up with this idea?
We had been thinking about it for a while. So I briefly mentioned before the camera fell down there that when we started the company up in Canada, it was more of a side project, and we were doing a lot of drone services, building and flying drones. We did some work with Aston Martin, with major news corporations, telecom, RCMP, which is our version of the FBI up in Canada. And so we had extensive experience not only flying the drones, building them, but also selling them, especially to government agencies. And so while we were doing this within public safety, we were starting to realize that the counter-drone space was something that was really challenging, and many people wanted solutions. I always laugh when I see these pictures of these. They look like a oversized, like a Halo gun. I'm not sure if you've ever played video games where you have to point this device at the drone, and it uses sort of electronic warfare or counter-drone radio waves to be able to intercept the link between, we call it a C2 link, between the individual who's flying the drone and the drone itself. And so then once you've hijacked that drone, you can land it, you can bring it over, you can disrupt it. There are lots of things you can do. So we were looking at some of those solutions, and we were like, they're not really that good. China uses them a lot, Japan uses them a lot, but we realized as well that like the technology that's coming out now where the drones are able to fly themselves more autonomously, that's going to pose challenges for those solutions because they're not emitting any radio waves at all that you can intercept. The drones themselves are able to be programmed remotely, and then the aspect of even having fiber optic cables. This is something we talked about on the hackathon as well, about what would happen, how do you intercept these drones, and many people had some really creative solutions for it. We think we're doing it in an effective way that allows us to produce 10,000 units a month, not just a handful that are really, really good. We want to be able to protect against the majority of it. There will be some edge cases that we're kind of trying to think about how we can tackle, but we want to be able to handle some of those drones that may have shielding, may be autonomous, so that the individuals are still protected, whether it's on the battlefield or in a stadium, for example.
I see. Did you join any accelerator?
I did, yes. I joined Techstars shortly afterwards, and that was an amazing experience. We met so many cool founders. It was super selective. I would say because Canada doesn't have a Y Combinator type, this is sort of the accelerator that you would strive to be when you were in the entrepreneurial and startup space. And so we got really excited about that because it was just I was the only solo founder that was there. I was also the youngest. And so it was a very surreal feeling about having someone kind of take a chance on me while I was still a relatively young and inexperienced founder. But that was around the same time we did Dragon's Den 2. And so it taught me as well kind of how to create this dynamic, not only of scarcity, but also just demonstrating your competence and what you have going on. And so normal human dynamic where people want to be a part of something that is growing, capitalizing on the momentum we had to be able to, once you have good momentum, don't let it stop, keep rolling, and so that you can then reach out to investors, reach out to people who want to support you, and people get excited at the progress that you have, especially when you're doing multiple things. And so that, I believe, helped push us over the edge, and we were one of 12 companies out of, I think, like 2,000 who applied. And so really, really lucky and grateful for that opportunity.
Amazing. And then, so if you have to give something, maybe like 3 key takeaways from Techstars Canada. Maybe our audience, they may want to apply Techstars. So what do you think?
Yeah, I would say, so it's funny because being in San Francisco, I don't think Techstars has the same reputation that it does in Canada. And I think it's okay if you are at the stage where you need support, don't overthink things and don't be like, oh, well, Y Combinator might be a slightly better accelerator, so I want to go that and I'll reject or not apply for Techstars. There are lots of accelerators that are helpful, and given the stage I was at, I was 25, I had a different sort of pathway than many entrepreneurs here do. And so me kind of slowly scraping by and figuring it out when I was 20, when I started the company, it is very different from this model. And so Techstars helped give me not only the experience, the introductions, it broadened my American network significantly, as well as the investment that we got as well. Even if the terms aren't as competitive as some of the terms that I see some people here do, you also have to look at the reality where you're at and sort of say at the time, that was what it was. And so I think the biggest key takeaway is like the offer you have is better than any potential offer in the future that might be better. And so I think it's not that you're settling, but you have to just understand on the situation where you're at. For me, best decision I've ever made. We were able to go, we met dozens of entrepreneurs at the Google offices. My San Francisco connections took off. It really pushed me over the edge. The managing director was like, yeah, you need to be here. And so when you have these people, in addition to investors here saying this, it's a no-brainer that we say, okay, we're going to go get our O1 visa. We're going to bring some of the team here. We're going to do what we can to kind of grow the company here. And that is where we transitioned, end up becoming a counter-drone provider. And we just, progress that gets made on a daily basis here, it outmatches anything possible in Canada. And so I think I love my home, but I'm so happy to be here, and I'm lucky to be given this chance.
Super beautiful, because I also like a kind of a transition situation from Japan. I used to be New York anyway, so okay, as an entrepreneur, and you have a great reputation in Canada already, but thanks to Techstars experience, you made the decision, okay, I have to jump on the Silicon Valley, correct?
Absolutely, yeah, and I feel it's hard to obviously reflect and sort of be like, what stage am I at? But when you're honest with yourself, you're sort of saying, we've been through several accelerators in Canada. Another one is League of Innovators, really great. That was also super helpful when I was sort of at an earlier stage and trying to really just needed a community. Once you have done those and you sort of are making money, you've raised a little bit of money, and you're making progress, the community starts to feel small. And so I think what ends up happening is you get a lot of people who are not necessarily at the level that you're at. And so I think a good mantra that I had was like, if I feel as though it's harder for me to grow among the community where I am, it's possible it's time for you to find a community that has the ability to have you grow. I kind of view it as like, I would rather be a small fish in a massive pond than kind of have this, like, have grown to a point where I feel like I've almost extracted all the possible value I can from the community. And I don't mean like people, I just mean the events that are there, the ability to hire talent. It's sort of this cumulative feeling as well that you get of like, it's more difficult to learn from people here. And I think that's another aspect about it, of like, people aren't taking as big of risks up there. And so when you're living with other founders who are taking big risks, when you're going to events and parties where there's always founders that are doing this, it really helps push you as well to be in a different state of mind than if I was at home where I'm comfortable. My family's there, my friends are there. It's a different dynamic. And so I think it's good to put yourself in a state of discomfort, because you're going to grow faster and better. And we're going to be more successful here than we could have ever possibly been up in Canada, I believe. So
I really love it. So, many people, I wish at some point I'm gonna go San Francisco. Now, changing mindset, and then you can do it. You don't need to bring all your family to San Francisco, only yourself, right?
Yeah, and I love it here. I think it's different for sure, and I think that's okay, as long as you're able to commit and say, this is what I want, and I know this is for the best. That's okay. I think obviously family is hard, but the reality is it's a 4-hour flight home to Toronto. It's not that far. And so I think I think of some of my friends who have family in Europe, in Asia, and Africa, and it just is, it's not even comparable to that. That's a flipped time zone, so you're asleep when they're awake. It makes it a lot harder to even communicate. And so at least for me, like, I'm going back home for an event, and I have the ability to travel. Like, San Francisco is such a good travel hub, so is Toronto. It's not really a challenge yet, at least, because I have no mortgage, no kids, no wife. It makes it a little bit easier to make those decisions. I'm sure it would be harder if I was 10 years into the future and I did have kids or a mortgage somewhere, I think.
See, makes sense. Okay, tell us about your team. So how many people work with Hober?
So we have 5 full-time now. We have a lot of part-time and contract employees. We've previously worked with over 250 pilots across America in our drone delivery operations that we've done. That was sort of something that we had actually. It's interesting how it progresses from doing services, from then doing procurement with public safety agencies and governments, then switching basis and trying something super innovative like drone delivery. And while we were successful in that, the capital required to push it, as well as what we were delivering, like it ended up not being something that we thought would be able to scale easily, because you're beholden to a lot of the regulatory bodies, and that was a big challenge for us. So we targeted these locked markets in Toronto, like the Toronto Islands. We were able to get over 11,000 deliveries, paid deliveries, being profitable. We just viewed it and we said, there are not as many other locked markets like the Toronto Islands that we're able to capitalize on, and so the upside right now is a little bit capped. And so coming to San Francisco, we thought, let's start up drone deliveries for the cargo ships. Higher potential average. Instead of $20 a delivery, we can charge $400 a delivery. So the unit economics absolutely work in that instance. I think what led us to sort of transition more into the counter drone space was talking to the owners of these ships and planning out these operations and saying, yes, they wanted the drone delivery. However, what they wanted more was something to stop drones as they were going through certain areas of the world where that was a challenge, and even just general detection and protection so that they can let the Coast Guard or the harbor police know, and they have procedures to deal with people who are flying drones. And so that was something that sort of caused me to pause and go, not only is this in market, there are prisons, super yachts, many other locations that we call soft targets, so they're more vulnerable to drone attacks, as well as in the military. And so I think that was a big theme at USS Hornet. That was something that we spoke with many, many Ukrainians who are saying, this is what we want. We want what you are building. And I think instead of us seeming like we have a great idea and we're pushing it, we have the pull of the market now. And so that feeling was something that it was strong with the drone delivery, but it was not as strong as this. And so I think when you feel that strength of someone saying, I want your product, I'm ready to buy it, please make this, and you hear that half a dozen times, you go, okay, that means we should really take this seriously. So the past several weeks we've been really talking, and our goal is essentially to get sales as much as possible, so that strengthens the potential round that we do to be able to grow the team from just 5 to 10 to 15 of really smart, really talented engineers.
Let's talk about, so you have something connection with Japan, correct?
I do, yes. The managing director of Techstars, he phenomenal entrepreneur, and so he had mentioned that when I'm in Japan that I should let him know. And so over the next couple weeks we're going to be likely going there and chatting not only with him, whose name is Yuki, but also with many of the entrepreneurial drone companies that are there, many in the counter drone space, many in the drone delivery space, to chat with them, see how the market is going. And I'm an avid skier, and so this is sort of an opportunity when it's a little bit slower near the end of the year for me to spend a weekend and a couple extra days skiing and kind of meeting some really fantastic people there.
Amazing. And then funny thing, I gonna go to Japan in same time, so I gonna help you to connect with some entrepreneurs.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. I heard so many good things about Japan, and specifically Tokyo, where we would be flying into. It's just a phenomenal place. I think it's an amazing culture, and it's new. And so I think that's something that is important as well, to kind of be pushing yourself to have these new experiences. And when you get these invitations to travel somewhere and they have a almost dual purpose, I get to experience a beautiful new culture and also spend time with some fantastic entrepreneurs and sort of expand my network. It's a no-brainer, and it absolutely is something that I want to do. So,
yay! Amazing. So, okay, last two questions, Cameron.
Okay.
So, one. So I heard a little bit. Your fun fact is you are a serious athlete, correct?
An Ironman last year, and so that was fantastic. Yeah.
What? Which city did you go to?
Mont Tremblant. Do not do Tremblant. It is very, very hilly. It was one of the more difficult ones because of that.
In Canada?
In Canada, yep. It's in a province called Quebec, and it's a very popular ski spot, and I've gone there growing up many times, and so it was nostalgic kind of biking through these areas, very hilly. But after you've done an hour swim, which is about 3.8 kilometers, I believe, is the swim, and then it is, I'm trying to think to convert it to miles, but about 180 kilometers of biking, which is very long. And so that took me 5.5, 6 hours to do. And so that is, it's not fun. Everything gets sore, your hands, and you're spending essentially 6 hours on a bike. So that was super tricky. And then after all that, you run a marathon.
Full marathon?
Full marathon. And so
crazy.
Yeah, and the hills are not really that fun after you've been working out all day. So super exciting though. My family had come, they were supporting me. It was one of the things that I think it's important to do difficult things like that, because it also puts into perspective how it's okay to take on hard things. And it also is just something that I want to improve myself and stay healthy and fit. And so I was really lucky to be able to do it and complete one.
Wow, cool.
Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, I really love biking, swimming, and a little bit jogging. I have never ever do like even mini triathlon, but I'm getting good influence from you.
You should.
Yeah, next year in California.
In California.
Yeah,
it's nice and sunny here.
why not?
I believe that you need to work incredibly hard to get things done, but when you have a team and you also are efficient with what you do, prioritization of the things that you need to get done is just important. And so when you can prioritize ruthlessly and delegate the rest, it means that you don't have to work 16-hour days, you can work 12-hour days and still have time for a run and eat and go to bed. And so I think most of my life when I'm here is just working out, eating, and work. That's it. And so I think it's very simple. It's like many other people feel the same way. And so I think that's why we get along. But as long as you're efficient, like there will be times where it's late and I just like, you need to go to bed. If you're not being efficient, there's no point in staring at a computer screen if you're barely getting any work done, and it messes your circadian rhythm up. You feel shitty the next day. it's not worth it. And so I think ensuring that you're healthy and you can do this a long time, because I have been doing it a while, I kind of know habits to sort of say, hey, I've been working 12-hour days, 5-6 days a week for 6 years. How do I keep doing that for another 6 years? And so it's not I go do 14 hours a day. It's that I can still do 12 hours a day and ensure that I take a rest day to take a walk outside, to get some sunshine, to ensure that I'm not kind of getting sick, because that's something that can easily happen, and people get burnt out all the time.
Yes.
So that's what I'm really trying to avoid, especially as a solo founder. It can be difficult because everything is on me to be able to decide, to hire, to fire, to raise, to not raise, to where to spend money, how much to pay people. It's harder when you are alone, but it's very, very rewarding, and I absolutely love every minute of it.
Yeah. This is good. Prioritize and make discipline. So thanks to this tool, we can avoid burnout, because like startup is not a sprint, it's a long marathon. Yeah.
Exactly. Just like the athletic stuff we were talking about, there are times in which you do need to sprint and you do need to spend every second of every day in the office, but if you're preparing well, those times are things that you can prepare for, and you have the capacity to scale to meet that, and you have people who can help you, because it is a team event. It's not something I cannot do it all on my own, so I have to surround myself with amazing team members, and I've been very, very lucky to find people who fit that criteria.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So Cameron, last question.
Sure.
So tell us about your next milestone in the next 1 year.
The next milestone for the business is going to be to deploy our solutions in theater, which essentially just means within an area in which we can actually shoot down and just detect drones. And so that is going to be something that a lot of iteration is going to have to occur for us to kind of have a widely scalable and accepted solution. But we have amazing progress so far, and we think that is going to be a major, major milestone for us to actually deploy it and help protect people who are potentially going to be harmed by drones. And so I think that's for the work. For the personal, I want to run 100 kilometers in one go. So it's 2.5 marathons roughly. I think that is something that would be really exciting. I'm used to more biking, and so the running part is going to be interesting to kind of build up to, but it is a bit of a running culture here, and so I think it's just being disciplined with that. It is a good goal that helps me center some of the energy and have something to look forward to.
Thank you. And if you are looking for new talent or, I don't know, investors, you can.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to be raising a little bit for our counter drone solution. We're always looking to hire amazing people. Please reach out. My name is Cameron Rowe. I'm Cameron Rowe Hover will yield lots of articles and podcasts similar to these, as well as just our website and my LinkedIn. It's Cameron, last name Rowe. Hover spelled Hover. If you're able to look us up, reach out, send a message. Happy to have a chat.
Yes, great. I'm gonna put your LinkedIn link and company link. Yes. So Cameron, thank you so much for your amazing wisdom today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate chatting with you.
Bye-bye. The 3 key takeaways from a conversation with Cameron. 1. Creating simple and scalable drone protection solution. Cameron explained how Hober focused on making easy to use and affordable tools to protect people from dangerous drones. Their goal is to create products that work in many industries, from business to military, and can be more in large numbers, helping more people stay safe. 2. How San Francisco helps founders grow. Cameron shared how moving to San Francisco and joining accelerator like Techstars helped him meet investors, grow his network, and find new opportunities. He's encouraged founders to take chance and surrounded themselves with people who take big risks to push their business forward. 3. Building a startup is like running a marathon. Cameron compared building a startup to running a marathon. Success takes disciplines and a strong team. He highlighted the importance of staying healthy, prioritize tasks, and balancing work to avoid burnout and keep growing the consistency. Yes, I am also love jogging, swimming, and biking. And this podcast also we have to keep consistently and continually, right? So I really emphasize of what he said. So I really love it. Yeah, I would love to talk about it more with him. Anyway, thank you so much for watching our episode today. We hope today's episode will help your future and career. Okay? バイバイ。じゃあね。またね。